Hey, how's it going? Today we're going to talk about Pinia. Pinia is the newer solution to global state management in the Vue ecosystem. It's officially the recommended solution over Vuex, so it's definitely worth your attention. In this video, I'll go over a quick crash course of how to use it, how to install it. If you're creating a Vue 3 application, you'll notice that the new Create Vue scaffolding tool, which is, I think, basically going to replace Vue CLI, that comes with an option that asks you if you want to use Pinia. That's actually what we'll use in this video in just a sec. But let's talk about the other options. You might have also heard of Vitess, which is a very popular starter template, which is much more opinionated. It has a bunch of things in it, and one of those things is Pinia. So if you pick two of those things, if you're creating a new application from scratch, it's pretty much very easy to add in. Now, if for some reason you're still trying to use Vue CLI, there is an unofficial plugin for it. You can, of course, just install it from scratch, especially if you have an existing application and you want to drop it in. So what you want to do is npm install Pinia, and that exports a create Pinia method, which you'll use to create the root store. And you want to provide that root store to your application. So in Vue 3, you'll use app.use. If you're coming from Vue 2, if you're installing in Vue 2, you'll want to use that same create Pinia to create the root store and then provide it into your Vue application. But you make sure that you also include the Vue Pinia plugin that you need to use in the old Vue.use plugin API. Oh, and finally, as for Nuxt.js, it's actually a lot simpler to install. You just make sure to install Pinia itself like we did before, and then you'll want to install Pinia/Nuxt. And ideally, you're already on the composition API, but if not, you'll also want to install the Nuxt.js composition API. And then in your Nuxt config, make sure to add both of these in the build modules. And if you don't already have it, I highly recommend installing the Vue Devtools, specifically Vue Devtools 6, which if you go into their website, right now it's in beta. So if you're doing this today, you're going to want to download the beta version. I think probably in a couple of months, it'll be the official version. But the version 6 has actual direct support for Pinia, which is why you want to use that one. Okay, so for my case, in this tutorial, I'm going to create a new application using that new scaffolding tool that I mentioned. So I'm going to do npm init vue at latest, type in a project name, add TypeScript. I'm going to select yes here because the typing support is actually one of the things that I want to show off in this video. And when you get to the part where it says add Pinia for state management, make sure you select yes. And then for the rest of the questions here, I'll probably select no just to keep the code base simpler, but make sure to select whichever one you want. All right, so we're gonna do change directory into our learn Pinia directory, run npm install, and then open that in VS Code. Within VS Code, I'm actually just gonna run the application using npm run dev. And you can open that on localhost 3000 like I have here on the side, as you can see. All right, from here, I'm actually just gonna clean up this page. That way we can kind of use it for our demo. All right, as you can see, I reduced it to just have this learn Pinia hello world message, just that nice green text. Real quick, by the way, you'll notice if you open up main.ts, that's where the create Pinia is happening, the root store. That's how we're sort of enabling it for the application. All right, so let's start working with Pinia. You'll notice that in this initial code base, we actually already have this stores directory, and there's already an example store in here. So this example kind of shows you what most typical stores usually look like, and this is where it starts to, I think, deviate from something like Vuex. Vuex usually has a like a massive store, and it might have sub modules, whereas Pinia sort of promotes smaller composable stores. It's very similar to something like ZooStand if you're coming from the React ecosystem. But anyways, you can see that pretty much to create a store, you use define store. You provide a unique ID to that store. You provide a state property, which is a arrow function that returns your initial state. And then you have getters. Getters are very much similar to how getters work in Vuex, and we'll see this in action in a little bit. And then we've got an example of an action here that manipulates the state. By the way, most people who make this tutorial with Pinia uses the same exact counter store because it's the one that's in the documentation. What we'll actually do in this video is we're going to create a pseudo banking application where we're going to simulate a like a credit card and the transactions with that, and sort of calculating what the current state is with the various transactions. So make sure to stick around. But I am going to use this counter store to just show you the basic API, and then we'll move over to that banking application in a few minutes. All right, so once you have a store created like this, what you want to do to bring it into a component is first you want to import it. So we're going to do use counter store. All right, so you'll notice that that's importing from our store/counter. So I'm going to turn that into a variable store equals use counter store. By the way, we're using the script setup here. You can also use this in the composition API, like the regular setup method. You can use it in options API. That's all covered in the documentation, but we're going to stick with a simple example here of script setup, which you should know that pretty much variables that you define within the script is sort of automatically exposed to the template. So as an example, let's say that, let's create a simple button that includes the current count, and then when you click it, it's going to increment. So we're going to do store.counter, and you'll notice that that's going to take in the counter state that we have, which is initialized as 0. And let's try to increment it by adding a click behavior here. We're going to do onClick store.increment, and let's click. Very simple, right? And from here, let's talk about the other various APIs that you can use. So we have an increment action here. So that's one of the ways that you can sort of create ways to mutate your data. There's a couple different ways that you also can do this. So you can also, for example, mutate the store directly like so, right? Store.counter ++. Let's refresh to reset our state back to 0. So that's effectively doing the same thing. Another way to do it is you can use the patch method, $patch. So patch takes in an object of partial state. So this is great for anytime you have state, if your state is like a massive object and you sort of just want to manipulate various properties on that object and you want to merge those changes with what the current state is, that's what patch is sort of ideal for. So I can also do counter here, and we can do store.counter +1, refresh, and that's the same thing. So depending on what you're trying to do, you basically have 3 different ways to manipulate the state. Now, I do recommend that you, as much as possible, co-locate all of your business logic and actions. That way, it sort of just travels with your store, right? It's not like littered all over your components. And actions also has a special thing about it where you can actually subscribe to actions. So you can listen for when those actions happen. And we'll see an example of that in a little bit in our banking application. So let's simplify this back to our action increment, which is a method. And from here, let's talk about the rest of the API. There is a way to reset the state. So let's create a new button here. And let's call this reset. And we'll do @click store $reset. And you'll notice that resets the state back to the initial state. And how does it know what the initial state is? It's basically what this function returns in our state property in the store. And in addition to that, you can also do like a full replace. So I think store.state, you'll notice it says state of the store, setting it will replace the whole state. So if for some reason you just want to do a full replace, you can use $state. And then these other things like on action, subscribe, and stuff like that, we'll talk about that later. All right, another property of a store is the getters. You'll notice that we have a double count here, which takes in the current counter state and just doubles it. So the way we access that in our templates, you can access it pretty much just like a property. So you can do store.doubleCount, right? Maybe let's do ×2 here, just so you can see, right? And you can see that the double on the right side here is the double of the left side. Also, real quick, if you do need to pass arguments to the store, you can call it like a method. You just need to make sure that you define your getter to return a function that takes in those potential arguments that you might have. All right, so that's pretty much the gist of most of the API in a nutshell, at least the ones you need to care about immediately. The other ones I'll kind of show you as we build out our banking application, which we'll get started with right now. All right, so what we're gonna do is in the stores directory, I'm gonna create a new, let's call this bank account.ts, and this is where we'll create a new use bank account store, and we'll bring in that define store again from Pinia. And remember, you need to provide a unique string in here as the ID of the store. We'll call it just bank account. Let's first talk about what we're trying to build here so that we know what kind of state management we need to build. So imagine that we're trying to simulate a bank account, and perhaps you have a credit card account, and you know how when you spend your credit card, it sort of goes, it creates transactions, but it's pending for a little bit, and then it takes a while. Eventually it gets processed, and then it updates your balance and such. So we want to simulate something similar to that. So our state is going to have, let's create an arrow function here, and we're gonna do, it's gonna have a balance, right? And this could be your current balance or probably your previous balance if at the end of your statement that's the remaining amount of money that you need to pay off. And then there's of course transactions, and we'll just initialize that to an empty array. And it's worth calling out here, by the way, that Pinia specifically recommends that you use arrow functions here, specifically for the state. That way, you get the best type inference as possible. That does mean that if you have a specific type here that you want to use, you might want to typecast this object. So, for example, let's say that we're defining the type for your banking details, right? So basically, your state here. I'm gonna do as bank details, and let's also define what a transaction looks like. Let's say that a transaction looks like this. It has a unique ID, it's got a type, it can be a charge, a refund, or a payment, right? And depending on that type, it's gonna affect your balance in a different way. It's got an amount, which is the dollar, and then a status of pending or processed. All right, so now that we have that initial state, let's think about how we want to display this information to the user. Now, if you think about a typical banking application, usually they try to display your running balance as well as your potential pending balance, which is, if you're using a credit card again as an example. So let's start with defining some getters to get our running balance. So let's add the getters property here, which is an object. First, let's create a getter which returns our processed transactions. And this will be really useful when you want to list it on the UI, what are your processed transactions specifically. And then to return our running balance is basically, if you think about it, is our current balance or previous balance. And then we're going to add in all of the processed transactions to that balance, and that's our running balance. And by the way, again, notice that we're using arrow functions here. Again, that's sort of the recommended thing to do. However, if you do want to use getters within getters, if you're trying to compose, so for example, if you're trying to calculate our running balance, you're gonna want to use the typical function syntax. So for example, we'll do running balance state, like your regular sort of function definition syntax. And that way we can use this, and this is going to point to our state, which includes, our getters and stuff. So you can actually compose your getters by doing this process transactions, right? And if we were trying to calculate the balance off of this, first we're going to get the amounts by mapping this array to just the amount property. Remember our transactions has that amount in there. And then we'll reduce that to just the added up number. And we'll make sure to return this and add the existing balance. And that's pretty much our running balance. Now you'll notice that there's squigglies here because TypeScript is sort of having problems. And the way to fix that is to just define your return type like so, and which is kind of odd, but that's just how, it's like a limitation with TypeScript. So it's just something to know about. Right, again, so just to summarize, for simple getters, you generally just want to use an arrow function and just use that state directly. But if you're trying to compose getters together and you need access to that entire store, that will be inside of this in your regular function definitions that are not arrow functions. All right, so with that, why don't we start displaying this balance to our application? So let's go back to the UI. Let's go back to app.vue, and we're gonna bring in use bank account store, and let's clean up all this counter stuff. So let's get rid of these buttons. Maybe let's change this to Bank of Pinia. Why not, right? All right, so within our UI, let's go ahead and render our balance, which is our store.running balance. And remember, you just access that like a property. So you can see we have balance 0 over here. And remember, we have a getter for our process transactions, so we can actually print that out on the screen as well. So we'll just do a process title here, and then we'll do a list, and within that list, we'll just iterate through each of the transactions in our process transactions, and we'll print out the $ amount. Now, obviously, our store is empty initially, so we're not actually seeing any of this. So what we're going to do is we're going to build a way to add transactions, and this will be a good segue for us to learn, again, how to create actions. So back in our bank account store, we're going to go and add an actions property, and we're going to add a new method in here called charge. Now, actions are a little bit different in that they're actually meant to be defined like this because they expect you to access this. That's why it's not an arrow function. So what we're going to do here is to access our state, we're going to do this dot transactions, and you can notice that it knows that there's a transaction property there, and we're going to do push, and we're going to do, we said that our transaction looks like this. It's got an ID, type, amount, and status. So what we'll do is say that our action takes in an amount, which is a number, and then we'll push our transaction to have an object that looks like this. It's a type of charge, has an amount, and then initially it's pending, right? Kind of like your credit card transactions. And we're gonna create a sort of dummy ID here. We'll just do date.now. And then you can return things from your action. So I'm gonna actually return that ID, and we'll use this in a little bit. So just copy that for now, and I'll explain it later. All right, in our fake pseudo very ugly banking application, we're gonna add a sort of a way for us to simulate a user, charging their credit card. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna add a very simple button here that uses our new store.charge, passes in 5, and it just says, buy coffee for $5, right? So as we click this, it should be adding transactions to a store, but notice that we can't see it because they're all in pending states, because our original list here is for process transactions. So what we'll do is we'll introduce a new pending transactions getter, very similar to the other one, except it's specifically looking for the pending status. And then we'll just duplicate this process code on the template, and we'll just change the top one to be the pending transactions. So store.pending transactions. And now when we click buy coffee, you might have to refresh the page. It should start adding to our list of pending transactions. Now, if you want to, you could also add a pending amount getter so that we can also display the total of our pending balance. And we can just add that up here, pending, store.pending amount, refresh the page, and now when we add, it's getting accumulated in our pending. All right, so pretty basic, right? So at this point, one of the things I haven't showed you yet in the tutorial so far is action subscriptions. So let's imagine that, after a certain amount of time, as you create charges to your credit card, it takes a little bit of time, and eventually it goes from pending to processed, right? Now, what we can do to simulate that on the client here is to use subscriptions on actions. So for example, you can actually do store.$ on action, and this takes in a callback, which gets invoked for every action that is dispatched. So this takes in an object with a name property, and that name will have the name of the action that's being dispatched. So you can use that to check, which action is actually running, and if you need to run some kind of logic when that happens. And you can also access the entire store from here. And then there's this special after callback, which is invoked when the action is actually done. So, one of the things you can do with actions actually is, if you wanted to, again, this is for, it's meant to include your business logic. So if one of the things you need to do within this action is perhaps make an API call. You can do that. You can actually just do async and await in here. So that's why the after method is in here is if your action is async, it's going to wait for that to be resolved. And then if you want to run any logic after that action comes back and is resolved, that's what after is for. So for example, you can do, this takes in the value that your action returns, which in our case is actually the transaction ID, right? Remember our charge action here takes it returns an ID, something like that. Or if you want to make this more generic to handle multiple actions, you can just call that result. But within here, we can do something like if name equals charge, then do something, right? And what do we want to do when charges happen? Let's basically try to simulate, a bank being notified that here there's a charge and you now need to process this. So let's create a new action to process things. So let's call this process transaction, and it's gonna take a transaction ID. And what we're gonna do is we're just gonna simulate some kind of something happening, right, over time. So what we're gonna do is we're just gonna do a set timeout with roughly 5 seconds, and after that time is up, we're gonna find that specific transaction and we're just gonna mark it processed, right? So very simple. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna call this inside our subscription here. So we're gonna do, if it's a charge, we're gonna do store dot process transaction, and we'll pass in the result, which is the transaction ID. And for some reason here, it doesn't always notice, or TypeScript doesn't seem to recognize that result is technically always a number here. But what we'll do to get around that is we'll just do, if there is a result and it's a charge action, we're gonna process that transaction. So assuming I didn't mess up, what we expect to happen here is as we add transactions, it's gonna take 5 seconds for each transaction, and then they're gonna go from pending to processed, which means it's gonna update our list on the UI, and it should also update our balances. So let me refresh the page here and let's start buying some coffee. And there you go. You should see that, after a couple of seconds, it kind of just flows down into processed, updates our balance, and then the pending goes into 0. Right? So that's a sort of a quick crash course on how you do subscriptions. You can do also subscriptions on the store directly if you want to. If you look in the documentation, there's a section there about subscribing to the state, and you can see that you can do $subscribe on the store itself. And this one is a little bit more useful if you're trying to listen on either direct or patch. Remember in the beginning, I showed you how you can just directly manipulate the state, or you can do the patch. So this is another way to sort of listen for those things specifically if you're not going through actions. And I should mention, I know someone's going to go in the comments and they'll be like, oh, you shouldn't do that on the client side for a banking application. Like, of course, this is just a tutorial. Don't take it too seriously. Realistically, they would probably do this sort of thing in the back end. But really, I just wanted to show you a quick example of how you can listen to actions. So perhaps maybe there's there's another section of your UI that's listening for state changes. This is one way to do it. You don't even have to do, the Vue watch. You can just use this, and it's a little bit better. And by the way, let's take a quick break and let me show you the Vue Devtools. By the way, this is Vue Devtools version 6, which again is in beta at the moment, but you can use it today. But you'll notice that if you're in this inspector mode, there's this drop down, and one of the things you can select there is Pinia, and that'll show you the current stores that are sort of registered on the page currently, and you'll be able to see your state there. You'll also be able to see the current value of what your getters are returning. And then you can even go to this sort of really cool timeline view, and there's also a Pinia section here. So this is sort of like a timeline debugger of sorts. So you'll notice that as I buy coffee, it's adding events to this timeline. So you can kind of time travel And then when you click on Pinia over here, actually, this will be very similar to the Vuex view in the older Vue Devtools. It'll show you sort of what are the mutations that are happening, and then at each mutation, what does the state currently look like at that moment. All right, so that's just a quick preview. Vue Devtools very useful for taking a look at how your state is changing without needing to log and stuff like that. Anyways, back to the tutorial. We're almost done here. The only other thing I wanted to add in here is perhaps a way for us to pay for our current balance. So if you think about it, a payment is sort of just the inverse of a charge, right? You can just do a pay method, and then instead of you sending the amount as a positive number, we'll just do that as a negative. That way, when we use a reduce, it'll just be subtracted, but we'll make sure to add it as a type of payment and then status pending as well. And then back in our app.vue, we'll add a way for us to define a value here, which is just an input box. So what we'll do is we'll create a new reactive state here, which is just a pay amount that initializes to 0. And then we'll add a simple submit method, which just takes that payment and then triggers an action of that payment and then initialize it back to 0. Right? So notice we're doing store.pay over here. And then in our banking application, we're just going to add that input box. We'll do a payment amount, input type number. We're going to do V model on that pay amount. And then we'll just have a submit button here. If we refresh the page, it should look like this. And yes, I know our banking application is extremely ugly, but the styling is not the point. The point is to just understand the state management. All right, so don't try to hate me on the comments too much. All right, so let's buy some coffee here, and eventually, right, it's gonna go into our processed and balance is updated to 20, and you should be able to submit a 20 payment here. Although there's one thing that we need to update here is we also need to process the payment itself, because if we pay here, this is gonna go into our pending, but because we're not processing that transaction, it's always gonna be sitting in pending. So what we're going to do is we're going to simplify our watcher over here to just process both types of actions. Again, obviously, this is a very simple example. So let me refresh the page and, again, buy a couple more coffees. Wait for it to be processed, and then I'm going to pay 20 bucks. It's going to go into pending, and then eventually that will also be processed. And now we have a balance of 0. Right? And then to wrap up our banking application here, just to be somewhat complete, right at the end of the month with your credit card, usually you'll get a statement, and then all of your processed transactions becomes your new balance. So let's add a new method here. Let's just call it reconcile, and what that's gonna do is it's gonna take the running balance, which is, again, this is a getter. So notice how we can also use getters in actions. So we're just gonna set the balance to the current running balance, which is all of the processed balance, and then we're going to empty out our transactions. And then just so we have a way to sort of trigger this, we're just going to add a button at the top here. So once again, let's do a refresh, buy a couple of cups of coffee, $25 worth, and then wait for this to be processed, and then let's do reconcile, and now the balance is just 25. All the processed is gone. And actually, if you check in the DevTools, you should notice that balance is now has that 25 default value, and then you can kind of go from there. All right, guys, that pretty much ends our crash course. Hopefully you enjoyed that tutorial. Let me know if you have any feedback, and I'll see you on the next one.